The Mobile Suit Gundam universe is packed with tons of various shows and timelines. From the Universal Century, which includes the original anime, Zeta Gundam, and many more, to the heavily inspired by Shonen G Gundam, to Gundam Wing, which is where I think a lot of folks fell in love with the franchise, you could go on and on. There's one show though that admittedly I hadn't seen and honestly had very little exposure to. GundamSEED. When I saw that the spiritual successor to one of my favorite ever Gundam games, Encounters in Space, was based on it, I knew it was finally time to hop into the cosmic era and see what it had to offer. Encounters in Space did an excellent job of portraying the story of Amuro in the One-Year War, so I was excited to see what this one brought to the table. Today, we're checking out Mobile Suit Gundam SEED, Never Ending Tomorrow. Released in the West for the PlayStation 2 in 2005, the game offers a set of game modes that, at first glance, doesn't seem too dissimilar from its predecessor. But there are some key differences, like the ability to create your own custom character in mission mode being absent. We're going to touch on all these game modes, but to start off, let's talk story. The game gives you, as the player, two different perspectives to play through the story of Gundam SEED from. The first is, of course, Kira Yamato, the show's main antagonist and pilot of the Strike and later Freedom Gundams. The second is Kira's close friend turned rival, Athrun Zala. And before we get too far into this, if you're not familiar with SEED, I'll give a quick overview that's free of any major spoilers so you're not completely lost. The story honestly seems heavily inspired by the UC timeline. It features two major factions, the Earth Alliance and Plant, which stands for the People Liberation Acting Nation of Technology. Plant represents the nation of 120 space colonies that are located at Lagrange Point 5, and its population is made up almost entirely of coordinators, genetically enhanced humans that possess traits such as faster learning, superior physical characteristics, and immunity to disease. Over the decades leading up to the events of SEED, Plant becomes more and more independent, relying on the Earth less and less as the years go on, and eventually even begins to develop their very own mobile suits, utilized by their military force known as ZAFT, which are superior to anything possessed by the, at the time, Atlantic Federation. The game's story picks up shortly after an event known as the Bloody Valentine Incident. After the fall of the United Nations on Earth, the Atlantic Federation forms the Earth Alliance and declares war on Plant. A nuclear missile is fired at a colony, killing over 240,000 civilians in response to a terrorist attack that was blamed on the colonies, even if they weren't the true perpetrators. This event triggers the First Alliance Plant War, or the Bloody Valentine War as it's sometimes called, and is what we find our protagonist mixed up in. The game's story picks up as Kira finds himself in the middle of the war. Little did he know that his home, the neutral colony of Heliopolis, was home to the G Project, a project created for the development of powerful new Gundams that had the potential to turn the tide of the war. This made the colony a prime target for ZAFT, whose goal was to capture the suits for their own use. Kira encounters his old friend, Athrun, who to his surprise seems to be fighting for the ZAFT forces. Kira then finds himself in the cockpit of the Strike Gundam, and he inevitably encounters his friend who has stolen the Aegis Gundam. The story continues on from there, with Kira working to assist and protect the ship known as the Archangel, which is sort of like this show's take on White Base as it heads to Earth. As the story progresses, at both the beginning and end of each mission, we see snippets from the anime, with some being narrated over to give more context to you as the player. I won't go into too much detail to avoid story spoilers, but the main events of the show are covered, from the beginning of the conflict to the end. A lot of your typical Gundam themes are covered here: loss, love, friendship, the horrors of war, hope. If you've ever watched a Gundam series, you know what to expect, and honestly, it delivers. There's even a Char clone, but that shouldn't really be a surprise at this point. As I mentioned earlier, you can play through the story from the perspective of either Kira or Athrun, which I thought was a really nice touch, as not only do you get to participate in different missions from different perspectives, but also you get different cutscenes and narrations that play, which really help to show the motives and feelings that drive each character. As Kira, you get to pilot both the Strike and later the Freedom Gundam, and while playing as Athrun, you get to take the helm of the Aegis or Justice Gundams. The Meteor attachment for both suits is accessible in some of the later missions, which really felt powerful to use in my opinion. After completing the story, you can go back and replay through the missions using any of the suits, pilots, and partners, which we'll talk about partners in a bit, that you've unlocked. Before we move on to discussing gameplay and some of the other game modes, I just want to briefly touch on visuals. I think the presentation of the game is really solid. It's not mind-blowing for the year of release, but it holds up pretty well. For some reason, I think I still prefer the look of its predecessor, Encounters in Space, maybe because the HUD in this one is just so cluttered, but otherwise, I think the game looks fine and fits right in with the quality I'd expect from the PS2 era of Gundam games. Alright, moving on to gameplay. It feels extremely similar to Encounters in Space, although notably there are far less of the on-rails sections of gameplay. They're present in some missions, but really few and far between. The game introduces the new partner mechanic, which allows you to choose from a decent-sized list of characters to use as your partner during missions. Depending on what game mode or mission you're in, you may only have a few to choose from, or many. The partners have various abilities that can be used a fixed amount of time during missions. The abilities range from HP regen to damage buffs, speed boosts, and more. My personal favorite gameplay implementation present here though is phase shift armor. Now, if you aren't familiar with this technology, here's a quick breakdown. Essentially, phase shift armor allows a mobile suit to use energy to reduce damage from incoming physical attacks, such as bullets or shells fired from mobile suit-sized machine guns or cannons. Doing so uses up available energy, and it doesn't last forever, but while the armor is active, the suit is essentially impervious to all physical damage. While active, suit appearance changes from a neutral gray color to the color provided by the armor, which according to the wiki could apparently be altered by entering different values in the quote-unquote armor voltage section of the suit's OS. Beam attacks can, of course, still damage the suit when the armor is active, but regardless, it makes an equipped mobile suit incredibly resilient on the battlefield. In-game, if a suit is equipped with this armor, you'll see a gauge underneath the HP meter that's labeled PS. Taking damage and firing beam weaponry depletes this gauge, but while it's up, you'll indeed find yourself impervious to physical weapon damage. It's very noticeable when it's depleted too, since you'll notice your suit's color change back to its default kind of darkish gray. Different suits also have access to special attacks as well, depending on how much meter you have available, although on a suit with phase shift armor, using those attacks depletes your available energy, so you have to determine if they're worth using. The game also features the ability to have your character enter SEED mode during missions. In the upper left of your HUD next to your pilot's portrait is a gauge. As you progress through missions taking and dealing damage, the meter fills up, and once filled, a short cutscene plays indicating that your character has entered SEED mode, which depending on who you're playing as, it'll give you various buffs until the gauge depletes. Perhaps the biggest addition to gameplay compared to its predecessor, although not my personal favorite, is the addition of attack mode. This mode activates when you go in for a melee attack or get close to an enemy and they attack you. The camera angle changes from how it's typically presented to something that I suppose you could say looks a bit more cinematic. While in this mode, you can move around freely and combo with your melee and ranged attacks, but you also open yourself up to receiving damage from your opponent in the same manner. I really wasn't a fan of this, it just seemed kinda clunky, I think is the right way to describe it. There were times when I wasn't exactly sure how my inputs were gonna translate into what my suit was doing, and it just felt kinda button mashy. Holding down your primary fire input makes a return here from multi-locking and firing on multiple targets simultaneously, which is imperative for dealing with larger groups of enemies or bigger targets like ships. You can double tap your boost button to do a barrel roll and dodge incoming attacks, which you'll probably find yourself doing quite a bit, which is another key returning mechanic. So yeah, overall, gameplay is pretty fun. I was just not a fan of the attack mode mechanic. Side note, if you're enjoying my content, be sure to drop a like and subscribe, it would greatly help me out. Moving on from gameplay, let's quickly touch on the additional game modes offered here. The first and most disappointing is Versus Mode. It's everything you'd expect in a Versus Mode, except you can't face off against the CPU. It's strictly player 1 versus player 2. Yeah, seriously, what the hell, why is it like this? It wasn't like this in the previous game. Thankfully, this is made up for a bit by the other two modes, Mission Mode and Survival. Mission Mode allows you to take control of your favorite character and play them through a pre-designed mission. There's 22 characters to choose from, so there's a nice bit of content here. The mode also has a really well done animated intro that you'll surely appreciate. We also get a Survival Mode, which has 3 different scenarios. The first is to defeat 100 enemy units. The second is essentially a hardcore mode where you and enemies have an extremely limited HP pool. And the third is a time trial mode where you have to defeat as many enemies as possible. There's also a unit viewer gallery where you can view rotating 3D models of all the units in the game, complete with descriptions of them. There's a Seed Facts encyclopedia that's jam-packed with tons of entries and lore about the series to read through, and a movie gallery where you can replay all the clips you see in the story mode. To conclude, I'd say that if you're a fan of GundamSEED, this one's a must-play. They essentially gave the show the Encounters in Space treatment, creating a game that is extremely well done at portraying the events of the anime. I would kill for a game like this based on the events of Zeta Gundam, but I think that ship has long sailed. If you haven't seen the show, this might be a decent way to experience the story, but if you just straight up don't like SEED, maybe give this one a skip because it's pretty heavily story focused, I'd say. Let me know your thoughts on the game down below. Thanks for watching. Until next time.